Hey, it's Dan's Models once again. It's Dan and John here looking at some HO scale boxcars, and we looked at some HO scale boxcars last week.
Yeah.
What's this?
These are some more boxcars.
I recognize the logo on these. I think that we have a product review of one of these cars, either that happened recently or is coming up soon.
Yeah. In fact, one of these cars is the same car that I reviewed.
It looked even more familiar than I thought.
Oh, yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Yeah, so these are both by Kadee, and I've been putting together a vintage train for a photo shoot that we're going to be doing. I didn't have a lot of vintage rolling stock, so I acquired some. These are basically fully assembled cars, and they're more or less stock. I didn't really do anything to them other than weathering, and I did change the couplers because they originally came with the larger, older style couplers. Mm-hmm. And I think the newer Kadee cars come with the scale couplers, but these are probably older production. Funny story about that. It's kind of strange. They have this coupler box. The coupler box is kind of an assembly, and it includes the stirrup steps, and it's got you can't see it because it's underneath the floor, but it has this piece of plastic that goes across, and the whole thing is kind of a unit. And so you can't, unless you want to do some major surgery on the car, you can't just change it to any old coupler. You have to use this kit that Kadee sells to replace that entire thing with another new one with the scale coupler in it.
That's weird. Like, it almost seems like they did that on purpose.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe. But,
to sell more stuff?
Well, yeah, maybe. If you remember on the review, the coupler height was perfect.
I don't remember. Oh, right. This was a 10 out of 10, wasn't it?
Right. Well, it's a Kadee car. You'd expect that, right? It's Kadee car.
Kadee height gauge.
Kadee height gauge, Kadee couplers. It was right.
If it wasn't right, I'd be a little disappointed in Kadee.
Right. Well, I with both of these cars, I got the kit and I changed them out. And the only difference between the part that I put in and the part that I took out was the size of the coupler head. Okay.
And it changed the height, didn't it?
It did. They were too high. all four couplers.
Shame on Kadee. They should know better.
I don't understand how that happened because they're not offset shank couplers or anything. They're just the smaller heads. So they should be in exactly the same place, but they weren't. And unfortunately, with these cars, the only way to lower them is to file the truck bolster. Oh. And Kadee trucks are made of metal, not plastic.
That's even more work.
So let's just say that took a while. But I finally got them right. But that was kind of a pain.
Yeah, well, at least now they'll work.
Yeah. But other than that, they're pretty stock, like I said, except weathering. So, and I made one a little bit dirty. This one's a little more dusty looking, and the other one's a little more grimy looking.
Yeah, it looks like you used well, we'll look at it in a minute, but I was going to say, because it's off camera here, it looks like you used some black powders on it. Yeah,
this one has a combination of powder and airbrush weathering. Mm-hmm. I used the airbrush for the dust color, mostly in the bottom areas.
Yeah, you do that a lot, don't you?
Yeah. And then after I airbrushed it, then I used some black powder with a micro brush to highlight the vertical weld seams and whatnot.
I remember that technique from the weathering and detailing videos. That really does make the seams pop a lot.
Yeah. I've seen that on a lot of cars, and I'm not always sure it's. Sometimes I think it might actually be accumulated grime, and sometimes I think it's actually because on a real car the sheet metal sometimes will bow a little bit between the seams, and I think it creates shadows and things like that. Well, where the model doesn't have that texture.
There would be a shadow anyway.
Yeah,
just from having it slightly in or out.
Right.
So, yeah.
But anyway, it looks good, which is the bottom line.
It's probably a combination of accumulated gunk and shadow.
Yeah,
in real life.
And then, of course, I weathered the wheels and trucks and all that with more powders.
Yeah, you can tell this one is grimier looking.
Yeah, so in this case, in this car, I used mostly powders to weather it. I used a lot of black to give it kind of an overall grimy look. Mm-hmm. And I also used some rust color, which is very effective on a brown boxcar to create faded areas.
The lettering.
Yeah. It's what I think of almost as a leathery look. Mm-hmm. But between between the seams, which just like the other car, I highlighted the seams with some black, but then between those seams, I went over it with some rust-colored powder, and then just blended it all together. And I think that, again, with it's hard to find photos with old equipment, but I did find a couple photos of these, and I tried to make it look at least somewhat like that.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, though, thinking about this, anything with panels, whether it's from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or 80s, it would still weather the same way.
Yeah.
So you could use something even more contemporary if you don't have photographs, to see, well, how does paneled stuff weather?
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
So,
sometimes you have to do that because it is difficult with, to find, the older you get with something, the harder it is to find pictures because there just weren't as many back then. I also used a lot of black on the roof on this one to, make it look sooty, like it, from steam locomotives or whatever.
They look cool.
Well, thanks.
Especially when you put them together and you can see like this picture we have now, you can see the contrast from one to the other.
Right.
It's pretty neat.
This has been part of a project where I've done a bunch of these older cars, like 50s vintage cars, and I actually did them all relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. But I tried to weather them so that they don't all look the same because I want them to look like they, didn't all come through the same
desert.
Yeah, right.
One thing I do want to mention before we go, which is something that maybe someone who's newer to this, something that I learned that I know now, which is you can tell two things. You can tell these are vintage cars, from a different era. One is the length, because they don't really use short cars like this much.
Not too much
right?
like box cars now.
And the other thing is the roof walk, because they don't have those anymore. So if you see a shorter car like this or a roof walk, it's from a bygone era.
Right.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this edition of Dan's Models, and we'll be back next week for another edition of Dan's Models. See ya.
See you later.